Richard Harlan stood at the head of the long wooden table, the firelight catching the edge of his glass as he looked straight down the line of faces. Lauren, this company has always run on loyalty and forward momentum. Some of us have carried the load for years, but there comes a point when the vision needs new hands at the wheel. Mark has shown he can step up without hesitation and bring the kind of energy the clients respond to now. Your work has been steady, but steady isn't what moves us into the next phase. It's time to let the people who are built for growth take the lead, while others find their place on the sidelines. Hi, my name is Lauren Bennett. I am 30 years old. Those words from my boss landed in the quiet space between the clink of silverware and the low crackle of the fire. I kept my shoulders relaxed and my hands resting on the tablecloth the way I had learned to do whenever the ground shifted under me. The annual retreat had always felt like a reset a few days in the Tennessee mountains, where the team pretended the office walls did not exist. Tonight, the cabin felt smaller. I had joined the company when it was still small enough that Richard called everyone by name and meant it. We worked late together, ordered pizza at midnight, and talked about the future like it belonged to all of us. I believed the word family when he used it. I turned down other jobs because the work felt like it mattered, and because I thought the people around the table had my back the same way I had theirs. Mark Sullivan came in a year later. He was quick with slides and good at reading a room. At first, we split projects evenly. I handled the details and the follow-through. He handled the room. It worked. Then the invitations stopped coming. A strategy session about the new client pitch happened without me. Richard said it was to keep the group small, so decisions moved faster. 2 weeks later, Mark presented the plan I had drafted in our shared folder. He called it a team effort and thanked me in passing. Richard nodded like the idea had always been Mark's. I went home that night and opened a fresh notebook. I wrote the date, the client name, and the exact sentences Richard had used when he explained why I had not been needed in the room. It was not anger yet, it was record-keeping. I needed to see the pattern before I convinced myself I was imagining it. Helen Porter started a few months after that. She sat 2 desks over and noticed when I stopped joining the lunch group. One afternoon, she asked if I wanted to walk outside for air. I told her about the meetings and the credit that kept moving. She listened without offering advice at first. Later, she said she had watched the same thing happen at her last company, and that keeping notes had saved her when she finally needed to prove what was hers. She gave me the name of a small business owner she knew who sometimes needed short-term consulting help. I thanked her and put the number in my phone without calling it. The pattern sharpened. Richard scheduled a leadership dinner for the new account. My name was missing from the email. When I asked, he said the table was limited and that Mark needed the FaceTime more. I smiled and said I understood. That night, I transcribed the conversation into the notebook and added the date of the dinner. I also copied the original proposal I had written and saved it in a folder only I could access. Helen checked in again the next week. She told me she had taken on a small side client of her own and that having something that was hers alone made the rest of the day easier to carry. I listened and for the first time opened the email she had sent me weeks earlier. I started small. A former client from 2 years ago needed help rewriting their onboarding process. I did the work in the evenings after everyone else had logged off. The check came to a separate account I had opened without telling anyone. It was not much, but it was mine. I did not tell Richard. I did not tell Mark. Helen knew because she had made the introduction, and she never asked for details. She just said the work looked good on me. By the time the retreat rolled around, I had 3 small clients and a notebook full of dates and sentences. I still wanted to believe the cabin would feel like it used to. The first evening was easy enough. People laughed and passed plates. Then Richard stood up after dessert and gave the speech that made the room go still. Mark sat to his right, nodding at the right moments. I felt the eyes of the rest of the team move between Richard and me. Some looked away quickly. Helen was at the far end of the table. She did not look away. I said I needed air and stepped onto the porch. The night was cold and clear. The mountains were black shapes against a darker sky. I pulled out my phone and opened the notebook app. The entries were there calm and dated each one a small anchor. I read the oldest one again the night Mark had presented my work as his own. The words had not changed. I had changed around them. A man came up the steps from the neighbouring cabin carrying a mug. He nodded toward the window where the team was still visible. "Sounded rough in there," he said. "Richard Harlan has a talent for making people feel like they were never really in the room to begin with." Seen him do it before. He did not wait for an answer. He walked back down the steps and left me with the steam from his mug fading in the cold air. I stayed on the porch, the notebook still open on my screen, the firelight from inside throwing long shadows across the wooden boards. Inside, someone laughed at something Mark said. The sound carried through the glass like it belonged to a different table. I closed the app and slipped the phone into my pocket. The choice was not dramatic. It was simple and already forming. I could walk back in and keep pretending the family still existed, or I could decide what I was willing to carry and what I was finally ready to set down. The mountains did not care either way. The notebook did not care. Only I had to live with the answer. I walked back inside the cabin and took my seat at the far end of the table. The conversation had already moved on, but the air still carried the weight of what Richard had said. Mark was smiling at something one of the newer team members had asked him. Helen caught my eye from across the table and gave a small, steady nod. No one else looked directly at me for long. The rest of the evening passed in careful pieces. People talked about the trails they wanted to hike the next morning and the client presentation that was scheduled for the final afternoon. Richard sat at the head of the table like nothing had shifted. When the plates were cleared, he raised his glass and said the company had never been stronger. A few people clapped lightly. I kept my hands in my lap. That night, I lay in the narrow bed in the room I shared with two other women from the operations side. The walls were thin. Through the wood, I could hear low voices from the room next door. Mark's laugh carried once, then Richard's deeper reply. I turned on my side and opened the notebook app again. The entries were still there, dated and clear. I added one more line before I put the phone down. "Retreat dinner, Richard Harlan," spoken in front of the full team. The next morning, the group split for a short hike before the day's session. I stayed behind on the porch with a cup of coffee. Thomas Ellis, the man from the neighbouring cabin, walked past on the gravel path carrying a small cooler. He glanced up once. "Morning," he said. "Hope the rest of your stay goes better than last night sounded." He kept walking. I watched him go and felt the words settle. They were not kind, but they were honest. No one inside the company had said anything that direct. When the team gathered again after lunch, Richard stood in front of the big window that looked out over the valley. He held a printed sheet in one hand. "We're making some structural adjustments," he said. "Mark will be taking point on the new client accounts and the upcoming pitch cycles. Lauren, you'll keep the current book you manage and support where needed. It keeps things clean while we scale." He did not look at me when he said my name. Mark stood a step behind him, arms crossed, nodding like the decision had already been discussed and settled. A few people shifted in their chairs. Helen sat very still, her pen resting on her notepad. I felt the familiar tightening in my chest, the same one that had started the night I realized my proposal had been presented without me. This time, I did not try to soften it with explanations. After the session, I found Helen outside near the woodpile. She was stacking split logs, even though the staff would do it later. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "That was not how it should have been handled." I told her it was fine. She shook her head. "It's not fine," she said. "I've been watching this for months. He does the same thing every time someone stops being useful to the story he wants to tell. I started looking for other work last week." She did not ask me what I was going to do. She just said the words and went back to the logs. I stood there for a minute longer than I needed to. The air smelled like pine and cold dirt. Inside the cabin, someone turned on music. The sound floated out through an open window. That afternoon, I walked the short trail behind the property until the voices from the cabin faded. I called the contact Helen had given me months earlier. The woman on the other end remembered the referral and said she had 2 small projects that needed attention before the end of the month. I told her I could start immediately. When the call ended, I sat on a fallen log and wrote the details into the notebook. The date, the scope, the rate. It was not dramatic. It was simply the next line. Back at the cabin, Richard pulled me aside before dinner. He kept his voice low and reasonable. "I know last night was abrupt," he said. "But the team needs clarity. Mark is ready for more. You've been reliable, Lauren. Reliable is valuable. It just isn't the same as leading growth." I asked him what the new structure meant for the clients I had brought in over the last 3 years. He said the accounts would stay with me for now, but future expansions would route through Mark, so the handoff stayed clean. He used the word family once more, the same way he always did when he wanted the conversation to end without argument. I nodded and said I understood. He seemed relieved. That night, I sat at the small desk in the corner of my room and opened my laptop. I drafted a short, clean resignation letter. I listed the date I would finish my current work and thanked the company for the years I had spent there. I did not mention the notebook. I did not mention the dinner speech. I saved the draft without sending it. Helen knocked softly on the door frame later. She had her coat on. "Thomas from next door left a note on my windshield," she said. "He said if anyone needs a quiet place to think tomorrow morning, the back deck of his cabin is empty. I think he meant it for you." She handed me the folded paper and left before I could answer. I read the note once. It was short, just the offer and a time. I folded it again and put it in the notebook. The final day of the retreat began with light rain on the roof. The team was scheduled to do a wrap-up session and then drive back to the city. Richard called an early meeting in the main room. He wanted to go over the new reporting lines one more time. Mark sat to his left again. When Richard asked if anyone had questions, no one raised a hand. I kept my eyes on the page in front of me and wrote the time and the exact phrasing he used about streamlining leadership. After the meeting, I stepped outside to the back deck of Thomas Ellis's cabin. He was already there, sitting in a wooden chair with a mug. He did not ask why I had come. He just pointed to the other chair. "People like Richard collect families the way some people collect stamps," he said after a while. "They keep the ones that still look good on the page and set the rest aside when the collection gets too big. It's not personal, it's just how they keep the page neat." I did not answer. The rain had stopped. The valley below was grey and quiet. I thought about the notebook in my bag, the entries that now stretched across 5 years. I thought about the small clients waiting for me to start. I thought about the version of myself that had believed the word family when Richard first said it at my interview. Thomas stood up and went inside without another word. I stayed on the deck until the rest of the team began loading cars in the gravel lot. Helen waved once from across the clearing. I waved back. Mark was already in the passenger seat of Richard's SUV talking on his phone. I walked to my own car and put my bag in the trunk. The resignation draft was still saved on my laptop. I had not sent it yet. The choice was still mine to make, but the weight of it had already shifted. I could feel the space opening where the old routines used to sit. It was not empty yet. It was simply no longer filled with the version of the story Richard wanted to keep telling. I closed the trunk and stood for a moment with my hand on the cold metal. Inside the notebook app, the last entry from the retreat dinner still waited. I did not need to open it again to remember the words. They were already part of the record. I drove back to the city that afternoon with the resignation draft still sitting unsent in a folder on my laptop. The notebook app stayed closed on my phone. The rain had started again by the time I reached my apartment, and I sat in the car for a few minutes, listening to it hit the roof before I went inside. The office on Monday felt smaller than I remembered. Richard had already sent the new org chart in an all-team email before anyone arrived. My name appeared under a section labelled Client Support and Continuity. Mark's name sat at the top of Growth and New Business. No one said anything directly when I walked in, but the conversations around the coffee machine paused for half a second longer than usual. Helen gave me the same small nod she had used at the retreat table. It was enough. By Wednesday, the new structure was already in motion. Mark scheduled a client call I had managed for 2 years and did not include me on the invite. When I asked him about it in the hallway, he said Richard wanted a fresh set of eyes on the renewal. His tone was light, almost friendly, the way people sound when they have already decided the outcome. I went back to my desk and opened the notebook. I added the date and the exact sentence he had used. The line sat there with all the others quiet and unchanged. That evening, Helen and I met at a small diner 2 blocks from the office. She had already updated her resume. She told me she had given notice to Richard that afternoon in a short email copying HR, so there would be a record. She said she could not keep watching the same pattern repeat. I listened and felt the space between us settle into something steadier than friendship. It was recognition. I'm not staying either, I told her. She did not look surprised. She just asked when I planned to send the letter. I said soon. She nodded again and paid for both of our coffees before I could reach for my wallet. We walked back to our cars in the light rain without making plans to stay in touch. Sometimes the cleanest exits leave the fewest loose ends. I sent the resignation the next morning. The language stayed short and professional. I listed my last day as 2 weeks out and offered to complete a clean handover. Richard replied within an hour with a calendar invite for a one-on-one. The subject line read only transition discussion. I accepted it and spent the rest of the day organizing files that had once felt like they belonged to me. The meeting took place in his office with the door closed. He sat behind the desk and did not offer me water or ask how the drive back from the mountains had been. He said he was disappointed, but understood that people sometimes needed to explore other paths. Then he asked if there was anything I wanted to discuss before I left. I opened the notebook on my phone and turned the screen toward him. I did not raise my voice. I simply read 3 dated entries out loud the night Mark presented my proposal as his own. The leadership dinner I had not been invited to, and the retreat dinner when he had announced the new structure in front of everyone. I did not call the entries proof. I called them my record of what had actually happened. Richard listened without interrupting. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and said the company had always tried to do right by its people. He used the word family once more the same way he had at the retreat. Then he said some contributions fit certain chapters better than others, and that it was better for everyone when those chapters closed cleanly. He did not deny the dates or the words. He simply treated them as history that no longer required his attention. I closed the notebook app and stood up. I told him I would finish the handover by the end of the week and that I appreciated the years I had spent there. He shook my hand across the desk the way he shook hands with clients. The gesture was polite and final. Helen left the same week I did. On her last day, she sent a short message to the team channel thanking everyone for the work they had done together. She did not mention Richard or the new structure. She simply said she was grateful for the people who had shown up when it mattered. A few replies came in with heart emojis and well wishes. Mark did not reply. Richard sent a separate company-wide note later that afternoon announcing her departure in 2 sentences and wishing her success in her future endeavors. I finished my last day on a Friday. The handover documents were complete and saved in the shared drive. I cleared the personal items from my desk into a single box, a small plant, a framed photo of the team from 3 years earlier, and the notebook I had carried since the first time I realized the story was changing. Amanda Hayes from HR walked me to the elevator and asked if I needed any paperwork explained. I told her everything was clear. She wished me well and stayed in the lobby until the doors closed. The first weeks after I left moved slowly. I set up a small desk in the corner of my apartment and started the consulting work I had kept quiet for months. The clients Helen had introduced were steady. I added 2 more through quiet referrals. The work was precise and solitary. There were no team lunches, no late-night strategy sessions, no one to share the small wins with at the end of a long day. The quiet felt clean at first. Then it began to feel like absence. I still open the notebook sometimes in the evenings. The entries had not grown any softer with distance. I read the retreat dinner line again and felt the same small shift in my chest that I had felt on the cabin porch. The myth Richard had built about the company being a family had done its work well. It had kept people working hard and hoping the next chapter would finally include them. When the chapter changed, the people who no longer fit the new story were simply written out. There was no cruelty in it for him. There was only efficiency. Helen and I met for coffee once after we had both settled into new routines. She had joined a smaller firm across town and seemed lighter. She asked how the consulting was going. I told her it was growing slowly and that I was learning to like the quiet. She nodded and said the quiet was the part that took the longest to get used to. We did not make plans to meet again. The conversation felt complete. Sometimes on slow afternoons I walked past the old office building on my way to meet a client. The lights in the windows looked the same. I could imagine Richard at the head of the table in the conference room, Mark beside him, the new team leaning forward the way we used to. The picture was clear and distant at the same time. It no longer pulled at me the way it once had. The notebook stays in the top drawer of my desk now. I do not add new entries. The record is finished. What remains is the simple fact that I chose to stop waiting for a place in a story that had already decided I did not belong in it. The choice did not bring applause or public reckoning. It brought a smaller life with clearer edges. Some days that clarity feels like peace. Other days it feels like the echo of a door that closed quietly behind me and never opened again. I still think about the words Thomas Ellis spoke on the cabin porch that night. They were not meant to comfort me. They were simply true. Richard collected families the way some people collect stamps, keeping the ones that still looked good on the page. I had been one of those stamps for a while. When the page turned, I was set aside. The difference now is that I chose the moment I stepped off the page instead of waiting to be removed. The consulting work continues. The clients are steady. The desk in the corner of my apartment stays neat. There are no more team birthdays or shared holiday dinners. The routines I once thought of as family have been replaced by the quieter rhythm of work that belongs only to me. It is not the life I pictured when I first believed the word family at my interview. It is the life I have after I stopped believing the story was still being written for me. Thank you for listening to my story. If you have ever had to decide whether to keep trying to earn a place in someone else's version of family or to step away and live with the quiet that follows, comment strength below. What part of the story stayed with you the most?